questions.
Okay.
Can I invite Peter to join us? For those of you who've submitted questions, we can now address those questions. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we now have a period of question and answer before a next speaker. I have a question here for Dr. Fenwick. How does medication affect the dying process?
Is that medication or meditation?
Medication.
I'm going to answer that. I asked if it was medication or meditation. Meditation, in fact, is one of the protective mechanisms for those who suffer less or least from monocarensis data. But that wasn't the question. The question is, how's medication? I honestly don't know. But I can tell you one thing, and that is that if you allow the doctors, why do I say allow? Because you haven't had a long enough talk with them. If you allow the doctors to give you drugs which immediately suppress you, like midazolam, then you won't be exposed to the dying process. But this is going to be a discussion that you have with your treating therapist. And I think what you need to say is, I want my pain looked after. Of course you do. So you have your morphine drip, and if you're allowed to, if you have the correct one, you can set the level of it yourself. But it's when you get very anxious, I think the data is beginning to show that a way to deal with that is to be able to talk to somebody, and that wonderful talk we've just heard really is what we should be thinking about, and that's people who go around the hospices and help out. Remember that the family members may not always be the right ones to do it, because sometimes if there is a lot of friction or a lot of sadness within the family, it's quite difficult to die in peace. So people who are trained in it, I think, will help. So don't have medication unless you need it. You'll all need morphine, probably. Actually, that's not true. Many of you will. But try to stay clear of the midazolam.
Thank you, Peter. I have a question here. I think it's probably addressed to Marcelo Saad. The question is, for the post-graduation course, do we need to be a doctor?
The post-graduation course we intend to start is not only for medical doctors, but as a post-graduation, the person must have a graduation. So the person must have some faculty diploma on whatever it is. It may also be from engineering or a physicist, it doesn't matter. But the candidate must present motivation to be in that course. We can eliminate some people that want to have a post-graduation diploma to earn more money in their jobs, and that they are not related to our objectives. But as a principle, any person must be, and not only doctors, because this is not something dedicated for the healthcare practices. The people we want to form, to graduate, is people that will act with the healthcare team, not necessarily be with a healthcare profession diploma.
Thank you. I have another question here for Dr. Marcelo Saad. And the question is, someone has written here, we do have ministerial ordination in our spiritualist churches in the UK. Could you not do something similar in Brazil so that mediums who want to work in hospitals can have official recognition?
Yeah. Spiritism is not a formal religious denomination. Spiritism assumed the form of a religion mainly in Brazil. It's born in France, as I will say in the next talk, not as a religion, but it was interpreted as a religion in Brazil. And currently, there's no ministerial ordination, a formal flow for this. Some federations has a program of study, and people who go through this program is considered at some level that can make some works. But this is not effectively a religious ordination. Okay?
Thank you. Would you like to read the next one?
You go ahead again.
Okay. We're having trouble reading some of the writing here. This is addressed to Dr. Fenwick. I thought the spiritual world was an extension of the material world. So why do all
New reality.
new reality after
Disincarnation. So why do all new reality after disincarnation? That's for Dr. Peter Fenwick.
I'm not sure I
make sense?
understand. Does it make sense to you, Peter?
A really interesting question. Thank you. Is the material reality just an extension of this reality? Depends what your source is, doesn't it? I mean, this is really a question for Chico Xavier, isn't it? Get him to answer that question. I'm coming at it from a point of view of science. And the point of view of science, there are two major components to science and scientific beliefs, and I use the word belief. One is that everything is material, and the other is that the brain acts as a filter mechanism. These are the two major theories. If you believe everything is material, then you'll have a really interesting death. Because you'll find out that it's not. And if you use the filter theory, then it's interesting. And so it's the filter theory really that we're considering. And does this tell us something about the extension beyond? I don't know, my own reading on it, and this is purely a personal view and I've no evidence for it, is that a lot depends on level. There are some accounts which people have sent in. I've had one or two suicide accounts where they've been trying to strangle their etheric body, suggesting that the world is very much like this one. And of course, the accounts are from mediums of people who've been shot, going on and not realizing that they're dead. And in all those cases, you'd accept that it was an extension. But when you come to a wider view, rather like Paul was doing, he was giving up his bodily form and wanting to merge with the consciousness of the universe, then that's something very different. So I don't know the answer to the question, but it's an attempt.
Thank you, Peter. The next question is for Dr. Marcelo Saad. Can you tell more about how the hospitals accepted Spiritism, the Spiritism approach, and how the doctors worked together with the volunteers?
The hospitals I cited were created dedicatedly by faith-based organizations that are spiritist. So they are created from the zero to act in this manner, to be a spiritist-based hospital. It's different to introduce these spiritist concepts in a general hospital, not faith-based, or based in another faith. Okay, so there's a great linkage in Brazil among Spiritism and healthcare. And Spiritism may act as a supplementary health system, mainly for the poor people. So many faith-based Spiritist organizations make many activities related to health. One of them is to create hospitals, mainly for mental health, based on the principles of Spiritism.
The next question is directed to both speakers, so I'm going to ask both speakers to comment on this question. And the question is, what would you say about assisted suicide? That's a good one, isn't it?
That is a totally fascinating question.
Do you have a fascinating answer?
Of course. I think it's difficult. Let me deal from my own experience of the suicides that I've seen. I can think of, this is one end of the spectrum. This is a girl who attempted suicide. She had a profound near-death experience, and which she survived. And we had her in hospital, and it was probably about a year before she was able to take her place in the community again, because she wanted to go back. And I would get telephone calls from people. There's one man in Wales, I remember. His GP phoned me up and said, so-and-so's had a near-death experience. And he was so impressed by it that he wants to go back. But there does seem to be a consequence about going back. And I don't have enough data on this to be able to say from the cases I've seen and the accounts I've heard, particularly from people who've attempted suicide and come back again. It's mainly in the near-death experience literature. It seems to be a limitation on these people. But now we're dealing with something quite different. I've got multiple sclerosis, or I have got another terminal illness. I can't lie in bed all day, and it's very distressing to me. Is it wrong for me to ask the doctor to hurry on something which is inevitable? I think it's a very personal decision. There've been one or two on the BBC that you may have seen, where I have seen the person go off to Switzerland for their assisted suicide, and it's quite clear to me why they're doing it. They're not doing it. One of them was doing it because he was profoundly depressed, and there was no evidence from the program that he in fact had attempted to have his depression cured. That would be my first reason with him and thing I'd do. The other is that it was very much a family matter, and he was extremely angry with some members of his family. And so he was going to Switzerland really to get himself out of the way from the difficulties that he was having. So it's going to be a very complex question. But if I was in the situation of lying in bed and not being able to do anything and could see, in fact, death was coming, would I hurry it? I don't know. I haven't been there, but I might.
I can respond saying what Spiritism think about the suicide. Like many others, maybe all others' faith and belief systems, the Spiritism don't permit the suicide because the sitter and their karma doesn't mean punishment. It means opportunity. Okay? So this karma, the situation present, is an opportunity to relink with the holiness and to superate some imperfection in us. So the situation is needed for the Spirit. If it's needed for the Spirit and the person cut this flow, the person have to pass in the same situation in another reincarnation for people that accept the concept of reincarnation. Thus, for the Spiritist point of view, is a bad bet, is a bad business, the suicide, because you suffer twice and with the regret to cut this life earlier.
Thank you. Next question is directed to Peter. Peter, could a person who's taken given sedatives still be able to experience terminal lucidity?
That's a very difficult question, because one is assuming here that if you have a sedative which really knocks you out, in other words, makes you unconscious, could you still alert from the effects of that sedative? And I don't think there's enough data on it. Because if that was so, you don't normally give sedatives to people who are in a state in which terminal lucidity will be required. In other words, people who are unconscious. You wouldn't give them a sedative. If you've made them unconscious with a sedative, could they still have terminal lucidity? Well, we don't know what the mechanism is, but I think my feeling is, yes, they probably could, actually. Otherwise, how can you get people who have Alzheimer's, profound Alzheimer's, or profound brain damage, have their lucidity? I think it's a really interesting question. But I suspect the answer is yes. Now, if it is yes, then why am I so much against midazolam? I think it's because of the fact that you are treating the thing wrongly. If you are anxious, then it is in fact the sorting out of the anxiety rather than the suppression of the anxiety. So I think the two are different.
Thank you, Peter. Next question is for Dr. Marcelo. How many hospitals do we have in Brazil? This probably comes from a person from Brazil. Do we have in Brazil that use passes and disobsession in a psychiatric hospital?
All the psychiatric spiritist hospitals will use these complementary therapies. And we don't have a map, a clear map of all spiritist institutions in Brazil. Even with the spiritist centers, that is the main ground for the spiritist activity, we don't have an exact number of how much spiritist centers we have in Brazil, and we have no complete map for these other initiatives such as the spiritist hospitals. But regarding the Spiritism, we see a movement very strong in Brazil that is derivated to North America, that we are accepting more and more such energetic therapies, mainly on oncological wards. So the Spiritist Pass or Reiki or other variations of laying on of hands is improving in acceptance in many hospitals, in different denominations, either religious or not.
Thank you. We only have time for one more question, I'm afraid, and then we have to move on according to the programme. There are lots of really interesting, fascinating questions still coming, but my apologies that we just don't have time for them all. But I'm sure you'll take an opportunity to have a chat with our guest speakers during the breaks. But just one last question. We have time for one last question. Have you seen the film Ghost? And do people really experience the dark or evil visitors in their death?
I can answer this. It's really interesting. In our survey, this was 2,000 letters on near-death experiences. The ones that we took 500 of those, and about 4% of those were negative. There've been, since that time, there've been a paper by Bruce Grayson and one of his colleagues on negative near-death experiences. So I'm coming really to answer it, but doing it from an altered state of consciousness. And there are three ways that people consider that the near-death experience is unhappy. One is they have an ordinary near-death experience, but they don't like it. And so that's one form. The next one are void experiences. And void experiences are when you find yourself utterly bereft, utterly lonely, just in this vast wilderness of blackness. That's one. And then the other one is, I think, much more delusional. It's where they experience negative features. One of the best ones that I know is person who was getting very close to getting an intensive care psychosis. And as he had his near-death experience, when he came round, he said that he had been pursued by devils that were burning him in hell. And they had pitchforks which they were pushing into him, which is pretty awful imagery. And in fact, as he slowly recovered, he found that the flames of hell were the heating pad that he was on in the intensive care unit. And the pitchforks were quite clearly were nurses coming in and sticking things into him. Or really, even because you're very sensitive, turning him over and things like that. So that's much more of a delusional rather than a near-death experience. So have I come across anything which suggests a negative experiences outside of the near-death experience? No. We've never been sent accounts of people with their loved ones shouting out, "Take me away, there are devils in the room," things like that. It doesn't seem to occur. Or if it does, people don't report it. And you must remember that a lot of our data comes from accounts that people have given. Are you going to write to some doctor and say, when my mother died, she was crying out that she was being chased by devils around the room? I think probably not. That she was ecstatic, much more likely. So there may be a reporting bias here, but I haven't seen it, so I don't think so, is my view, apart from the near-death experiences where there are some very few negative accounts. Have you seen it?
Nothing to add.
Well, I'm afraid we've got no more time for questions at the moment, so I'd like us to show our appreciation for our guest speakers and the questions they've answered. I'm sure we've learned just as much from the questions and the answers as from the presentation. So thank you very much for...
I have one question for you all. When you leave this hall, what is that word which is deeply ingrained in your consciousness? It is to be curious. Oh, come on, there are none of you saying it. It is to be curious. Exactly.